Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to switch gear a little bit, but just to give you a sense, this is a project. There is no paper. It's very preliminary. This is the very first time I'm presenting. Carla talked about some conscious or unconscious construct on thinking how people should behave. I'm going to talk about something else. I'm going to talk about self-identity mostly. So I'm going to talk about this project is really very much about the salience of identity. So more like who I am vis-a-vis who others are. And you know, the way you could think about, I'll tell you the setting we're thinking about this, but you know, think about a situation. The ideal situation for studying this would be a situation in which an exogenous force, a shock, makes the identity of the people more salient. They don't change. There is, you know, they can have, you know, you can think about a community being, having a certain level of fractionalization, a certain level of segregation, but suddenly there is a force that makes salient much more the belonging to each group of each member of this community, okay? So the setting we are using here is a setting that is very well known in, you know, among historians about the British influence in on the Indian caste system as we think about it today. You know, as many of you probably know, the word caste really didn't exist in India. Was a Portuguese word that was imported by the European after their settlement. There were some related terms you could imagine, and I'm going to have to skip and simplify things here, that relate to ethnic identities and to ritualistic occupational order, but there was very limited ranking in these, in the sense that you know, these groups were not ranked in any particular strong way. When the British arrived, again, I'm simplifying, also for a political economy reason, they felt very much the urge to classify and especially to create a hierarchy. However, it takes them a while to get there because they don't really get the system that well. And one of the fundamental tools they used to do this was the British census, which was introduced in India early on in 1871. But I had a bunch of trial and error. So this is a bit of a study of what happened with this British census and to what extent the census was created a new salience around ethnicity in India. So, you know, I'm going to give you the sense of what, very briefly, what the census did in India. In 1871-72, the British wanted to classify, but they had you know, they didn't really know how to do that. And so in fact, they decided not to standardize. In 1881, 10 years later, they classified caste into Brahmin, Rajput, and other Hindus. And then later, you know, the decennia later, they did classify caste into 49 occupational groups and 11 ethnic groups. But the debate at the time, if you look at their discussion, was mostly that the caste was fundamentally best defined based on occupational, and there were some very strong local cultural peculiarities, okay? This changes dramatically in 1901 when Sir Herbert Risley became the head of the census. And he is actually, he's an interesting character, but he basically is a race scientist. And I'll tell you a little bit of what he believes, but it really fundamentally changes the caste classification with this idea that he had, which is coming from, you know, Topinard tradition, that caste was fundamentally a race, and so it should be not different across places, and it's even more extreme. He had anthropometric views about the caste in general. Okay, and so what he does really attempt to a hierarchical classification. I'm going to show you a document from the census where he's actually ranking them. This gets messed up. It's complicated. The British completely underestimated how complex this was. Indian didn't cooperate, especially in certain regions. And so eventually in 1911, the castes were listed alphabetically, and then they were disbanded later on. Okay, so there is this sort of, I'm thinking about this as a shock. Okay, and let me tell you about this guy. He was an ethnographer, and he was a proponent of race science. This was very common at the time. He started as a researcher, so he became head of the census only later on. In his view, the width of a nose, the ratio between the width of the nose and the eighth was a way to identify castes. You think about Topinard, Lombroso in Italy. I mean, there were many of these and so on. And so he actually started debating early on, at the end of 1800, that this is a paper he wrote, that, the British up to then, they didn't understand what caste was, because, caste was fundamentally about race. Okay, so that changes really the narrative. So in 1885, he is appointed to conduct an ethnographic survey of Bengal. And he published this in this quite famous book. It is called The Tribes and Castes of Bengal. And he's convinced at the time, in 1891, that he has classified India in some way, even though he really has focused on that. Then he's appointed as the head of the census. And so he thinks, okay, now I'm going to, I have this map of India, I'm going to do the same. Okay, and so that's really what he goes about. And so he starts with this view that, he wants to create a better classification, and then it's extremely important for him to rank everyone. Okay, it's also important for the British because, of course, they had a model of colonization, of divide and conquer, and so they really needed someone to associate with, and so logically the people they would put on top would have help with them, okay? And so he has this view that the social position in terms of ranking of the caste is to vary inversely with this nasal index, and he has this measurement in Bengal, which he had done when he did his ethnographic survey. So his idea is to implement this, okay? So what really changes real, and what I'm trying to argue is that this is a fundamental change in the way this census is done, because from a local, abstract, from a local specific cultural concept, caste becomes a national idea, like, just as it is everywhere, okay? So let me just give you an example. This is Bengal, and this is the, the 1901 census, and here is really the list in ranked by him. This is basically the how he classified them. And this idea is that he sends the census officers with this map, and he does that, okay? There is a little bit of a problem in reality, because he's a bit disillusioned. He doesn't really know much about. Even in terms of, even in Bengal, of course, people didn't recognize in this classification, because this was his own classification. And so this is a census officer that writes back from Bengal and says, we're having problems, because in reality, when we ask people, they don't recognize them. And when we ask them what they are about, they tell us their occupation. They're not telling about their race. So there is a miscommunication, certainly. And so they are a bit confused about this. But he had done this classification, so they come with some ideas. So he really passed. The first thing you want to understand is even in Bengal, as many Indians did not clearly recognize this into this classification. So he was really out of sync a bit with reality. Things are even worse if you go farther away, because of course even the names that he had classified in Bengal they were not corresponding with what people there. And so here is another officer from Punjab that says the attempt to classify caste doomed to failure. It was doomed to failure from the outset. We know far too little of the complex organization of these castes to be able at the present to classify them in any valid way. Okay, so what did they do? They went back and forth, and to address this classification problem, he decided to create some committees, local committees with Indian people that would help them translate this methodology that he had created for Bengal in other regions. Okay, and he was somewhat successful to do that in some region, totally unsuccessful in others. So the process was dismantled. Okay. So, what was the things that made him successful? And, this is basically the treatment in this ward. What was successful is when he was able to create a hierarchical table. So we have right now the 1901 census, where in some regions you have an actual hierarchy. But also, this hierarchy was salient because it was communicated to the population. Because, if you do the hierarchy and nobody knows, that's fine. So, we think about this as one moment in which you have a shock, and some people really were told, you belong to this group, and this group is at this level in the hierarchy. And that's sort of a sudden situation. You can imagine happen in many other places when you make salient a certain thing. So what were the consequences? This is a map of the treated region. And so a couple of things, an economist, and this is work in progress. Of course, one of the things that I'm going to tell you, and I don't have the time to go over them, but ex ante on the pre-1901 census data, and also some data that we actually have from the Mughal period, from the Book of Mughal in 1501, these regions seem quite similar in many ways. What was the difference between them that really predicts the ability to treat was the distance from Bengal, because in some way in Bengal there were some names that at least were classified, and also the fraction of common caste names across regions, because, going with this roadmap, that was the ability to map. Gave the census office the ability to map, and at that point the committee were formed. There was some discussion about that. The hierarchical structure was formed, and, somewhat this process took place. Let me tell you a couple of interesting things that show that something was going on. So this is what we did, is taking the frequency of certain words, caste, religion, tribe, language, India, in the census to try to see whether there is a difference between the treated and non-treated region. And you see that there is a big spike only for caste between the treated and non-treated region between 1891 and 1901. So, this sense that this is becoming important, but specifically in those regions where he was quote-unquote successful. Now, there is a lot of discussion about animosity, because the moment the local are part of this committee, they say, wait a moment, why am I number 3? We want to be, and so on. And so I'll tell you later that there will be a lot of petitions that are getting started as a consequence of this process. But here is an interesting quote that says, the discussion of the relative rank of the different castes aroused an extraordinary amount of ill feeling and jealousy between some of the caste, whose position is disputed, and in more than an instance, a committee appointed to report, had an ability to come to a decision. So this was really acrimonious argumentation. This is in 1901, and so there were a lot of petition. And in 1931, this is an interesting quote that we found that when this was all dismantled eventually, somebody wrote, a census officer said, all subsequent census officer in India must have cursed the day when it occurred to Risley, no doubt in order to test his admirable theory of the relative nasal index, to attempt to draw up a list of castes according to their rank in society. Okay, so yeah. So that's really, and then he goes on saying, for every census gives right to a pestiferous delusion of representation accompanied to a high problematic histories, okay? So, this was like a, impact in society. And in fact, you see that in the treated region, these petitions to be relocated in this hierarchical table change over time till it was dismantled. So what do we find in this preliminary thing, and what happened? So we found some stuff that we thought were quite obvious, and because I have limited time, I'm not gonna show you the table, but we find that in survey done in 2011, individuals in the treated region have a much smaller out of caste network. So we asked, the survey asked how many people out of your group, your doctor, specifically, people that you deal on a regular basis, and they're way more likely to have a relationship within groups that, they identify as part of their caste. There is an element which, is a reminiscence of Alesina et al. Results on ethnic fractionalization. Remember, fractionalization here is not change, it's the salience of being different that has changed. So in somewhat is different, but the result, the outcome is very similar in the sense that there is lower provision of public good, how you want to measure that. So that's one of the data that we have. India is notoriously not very good data, but this one, we have a lot of public infrastructure and so on, and we show that there is a very big difference. The other thing which is less exploited in this literature, and I want to spend a little bit more time for that reason, is that politics seems to change dramatically in this region if you look at them today, okay? And I'm going to have, so the first table here is going to show you numbers from this survey that asked the question, how likely you are that you voted and you consider electing official and so on, or voting for local politicians which are out of your caste. And individuals in the treated region, they seem to be saying that is less prevalent in the treated regions. The other thing is also that politics becomes way more fractionalized in the sense that there are way more candidates are more likely to be elected belonging to certain ethnic to ethnic parties as defined in two different ways. There is much more. There are many more candidates and many more effective number of parties, which is a definition used in politics. So we don't have a big difference in the percentage of votes won by winning candidate, but we have really much more dispersion in terms of candidates. And one potential issue here is whether some of this provision of public good is driven indeed by a much more complex politics. Yeah, I'm done. So I'm going to conclude. Okay, so this is a project really in a work in progress, in which we want to, we wanted to try to analyze these episodes of making salient a particular identity, and we used the Risley treatment in 1901 sense. What we show is that indeed individuals perceive that, they petition, they they feel they belong much more to a certain group and so on. And then even though ex ante there were not fundamental differences in these regions, in fact, actually, somebody pointed out that, and there are more people that know more about India, that the region that were treated by the time the British left were in better economic shape. Nowadays, they're not so much. So in some way, there has been some sort of reversal. So maybe the British in the short term were able to put in place some extractive institution by attempting this ranking and classification, but it doesn't look like that in the long run. In fact, economically, these treated regions, they're not doing that well, especially in terms of collective action. So in the treated region, we see evidence of the treatment. We see petitioning. We see a big effect on the way individuals think about their network. Political competition seems to be different, and there is lower provision of public good. I'm done, Elliot. Okay?
So just two quick questions. So one on, I guess when you only had a brief time to go through the ideas, but there is this east-west gradient of rice-based agriculture in India that corresponds to a psychological variation. So Thomas Talhelm has analyzed this, and it looks like your treated region is in exactly the place you get a kind of parochial collectivism that he traces to the presence of rice-based agriculture and the way that affects the formation of tight kin groups. So I was wondering about that.
Yeah.
And just put the other question on the table, is the genetic data done by people like David Reich suggests that there's a real deep history to caste in India, and that these really were endogamous descent groups. It's the most, it's got the most amount of genetic variation, an order of magnitude higher than Europe, for example. So, these things appear to have had some deep reality.
Yeah. So so I'll start with the second, and the first one. I should probably look more into. I'm not saying that the British invented caste. There were these other words that really identified the ethnic groups. What they did, they created a ranking of that, which was based on this anthropometric sense. And so what I don't think anyone would argue that there are ethnicity differences between black and white, but the question is what happens if you make these differences much more salient for whatever reason. So I'm more interested in how this social experiment indeed generate the perception of being different and distant from the others. Because in principle, you could imagine that in other dimension, culturally, we may be similar or so on. And so this is, the idea is that the challenge is that Indian data are not very deep, and so there are difficulty in identifying variation. And so one of the possible confounding things are the first things that you suggested. Yes.
Classifications, or whether some occupations were more prestigious than others, and then how is this correlated with the British classification? Because it could be that if the discrepancy is high, then this is where people complain the most. Yeah,
so one thing we did, again, data are sort of limited, but one of the things that we did, and I think I have it at the end, we looked at here, this one. We have, there is very limited information about that, but what we have is that during the Mughal period, which is 1500, there were zamindar who were landowners, and they belonged to different ethnic groups. And so what we do, we try to see whether there was a difference between the treated and untreated regions in terms of having more of these landowners, which were in the upper class, that belonged to what later on the British classified as higher ranked, and we didn't find any difference. We don't have really other. I mean, of course, the priest and Brahmin were, a more important, but they were spread out, in both the treated and the untreated regions. But we don't have any other, measure of occupation. So this is the closest we could do, because we know that being a landowner at that time, was, of course, you were at the top of society. We don't see that the mapping that Risley does indeed coincide with being more likely to be a landowners in 1500. That's sort of a very limited answer.
So I guess just I guess three quick questions. So one is princely states. If we're looking at things that might reflect the map, that might be maybe a control for that. So these, so under British rule, these kind of independent princely states that were, and then just one question about the estimation. What I wasn't clear if things are just based on cross section, or you look at changes before the treatment relative.
So the only place where we have, the only case in which we have changes is when we, so we have, of course, not in politics, but we have in caste petitions, we have some data before and after, just to show that that makes a difference, and then and then in no, we basically don't have much in terms of because we don't have data, and that's sort of at least at the moment we don't have data. Yeah. Okay, I'll talk to you.